We're having a history after Cantilever. It is January 17th, 2025. But our subject again this evening is the history of Rainier. Its quiet beginnings, its notorious past, and its current success. But I'm going to go way, way, way back. Archaeological evidence shows that there was human habitation here in Rainier as far back as 8,500 years. As a boy here, I was always so much interested in the fact that my dad, Charlie Williams, and then Rainier residents, Lauren Erickson, Riley Hauska, Norman Celsus, all had collections of Native American artifacts. But the first white person ever to pass through this area between here, in the north side, was Jacques de Noyon in 1688. He was followed shortly thereafter by French-Canadian fur traders and missionaries. And that period of time from 1730 to 1840 is known as the era of the voyageurs. But specifically, there was a fort built right over here in what is now called Pillars Point in 1731. And the French prospered there for 32 years, but lost significant clout in the area when they were defeated by the British in the French and Indian War in 1763. But on the Canadian side, two companies were dominant. The Northwest Company, the Hudson Bay Company, and they eventually merged in 1821. But unfortunately for them, by 1840, the fur trade was pretty much over. And this period in this part of the country entered a very, very quiet period. But one must remember that during this period of time that the border between the United States and Canada did exist, but it was hardly noticed. Civilization was much more advanced on the Canadian side, and so those here on the Minnesota or U.S. side enjoyed the amenities that were available with our friends to the north. The Pillars Point, to give you a little history of that, just across the line here, was named after Robert Pither, who settled on the point in 1846 and stayed there for 72 years. You can imagine that. He became the agent of the Department of Indian Affairs of Canada, and the point was his headquarters. Ashley?
So the first white settler in Rainier was John Holler. He was born on April 12, 1843 in Cleveland, Ohio, to Samuel and Via Holler. He had 4 siblings, Henry, Sarah, Catherine, and Eva. And then in 1862, he was married to a woman named Eliza Stokes. And then by 1867, they moved to Monticello. And then Eliza gave birth to their first son, Harry. And I don't know what happens to Eliza between 1867 and 1868, but she dies. I don't know how she dies, but she is dead by 1868. So while they're living in Monticello, John was considered to be a man of great importance. He worked in the Minnesota State Legislature, or he served there for quite some time. And then in 1871, John gets married again, and he marries a woman named Mary Eliza Clark, and they would go on to have a bunch of kids together. So during his time in Monticello, he's offered the position of either becoming the postmaster in Monticello, or he can come up to Couchiching and become a U.S. Customs collector. So he decides that he's going to do that. And Couchiching at the time is Couchiching Village. So International Falls is still very new at that point. So he comes here in 1898 to take over those duties. And when he comes here, he actually comes to what is now present Rainier. And John's wife and 3 of their children come a little less than 2 years later. And the children that come with her are Dan, Eugene, and Raymond. And then the year after that, their 2 other eldest children, George and Ernest, come. Whatever happens to their, like the other son, Harry, from the first marriage, we don't know. Harry is not a part of this story anymore. Like he comes back in at the end, but like we don't know really what happens to him in the meantime. So anyways, so the Holler family is pretty big. He gets a claim that's a 40-acre parcel, and that becomes the present town site of what most of part of Rainier is. And he has a cabin that they live in, and from Couchiching to Rainier, there is no road. So there's no transportation. The only way that he could get to work and bring the kids to school is they either have to canoe, they can take a ferry, or you have to walk through some like janky trails through the woods. Like there's no other way to get there. So this is wildly inconvenient for him and, you know, getting kids to school. So he decides that he is going to sell his property and relocate closer to his job, which makes sense. So he ends up selling his parcel to a group called Cook and O'Brien for $8,000 in 1906, which is quite a lot of money. And his cabin becomes it's used as the engineer's camp when the railroad is starting to be built in 1906 through 1907. So this is the start of Rainier at this point. So that plot of land starts to get plotted out or surveyed to be sold into lots for people to come here. And then in 1908, the city of Rainier is formally incorporated in January of that year. And then their first elections for officials happens in April. So John remained a customs collection, is a customs collector until 1916, and then his health starts to fail. So he decides that he wants to take a year off and see if he can get better. Well, guess what? He doesn't. He dies. So, but he was 74, which was pretty good for that time period. So he passed away. And then the rest of the Holler family sticks around, which should be pretty obvious since there's a lot of things that are named after them. So Harry, the technical oldest child, the one that like just disappears, we don't really know a lot about him. I do know that he gets married to a woman named Maddie in 1889, and he worked as a hardware mechanic. But then he died at the age of 47, and a lot of the Holler kids kind of died younger, and why, I don't know why. George, who was the recognized oldest, he homesteaded in what's South International Falls, and of course his section that he got, that he filed a claim on in 1900, becomes known as Holler's Addition. So he had all of that, like he decided eventually to plot all that out and started selling little lots to people. He worked as a mechanic for quite a few years in M&O, and then he left to go out west. Their son Ernest, he worked as postmaster of Couchiching, and then he served as deputy sheriff. He also worked for the newspaper. Dan Holler, that name might sound familiar to people because he got married to a woman named Agnes Caldwell, which if you came to our Women in the Wild show, you might remember her. She was part of the Caldwell Sisters, which was a group of entrepreneurial women who came here and opened a confectionery. And so he married her and took over their business in 1907. And then they ran Holler's Confectionery until 1921. Eugene was a printer. He worked for pretty much every newspaper in Couchiching County. And then he ran the airport corner store, if anyone remembers that. And then Raymond was an auto mechanic. And I believe Raymond might have been the one that owned where Belong Furniture now belongs iSpace. One of the Holler boys, it was either him or the first son, ran their auto mechanic shop out of there. And then they had two other children, Charles and Johnny, but they both died young. One died at the age of 2, one died at the age of 15. I'm guessing probably they just got sick based on the ages and the years that it happened. And then Mary Holler, she lived until April of 1938, and she had been Mary Clark, so she had land that had been given to the city, which became Clark's Park, Point of Pines. So that's how that got that name.
I'm going to talk about the railroad and our Canada Bridge. The old timers used to say that 1907 was the year that everything went to hell here in Rainier. two railroads arrived in Overland that year. E.W. Backus had the M&I, the Minnesota International Railway. It was extended from Northville, International Falls. But it was preceded by several months by the DV and RL, the Duluth, Virginia, and Rainy Lake Railroad. The DV and RL was chartered in 1901 to haul lumber, timber, to sawmills in Virginia, Minnesota from this part of the country. But in 1905, the Canadian National Railway purchased the majority ownership and changed the name of the railroad to the Duluth, Rainy Lake, and Winnipeg Rainy Lake Railway, or the DRL and W. I hope you remember all this. They then chose Rainier as a border crossing over the Rainy River. The Canadian National, CN, then contracted with the Cheslar Rolling Lift Bridge Company of Chicago to build a cantilever bridge. This was done, and the first crossing was April 28, 1908. It towed a mix of boxcars, log cars, hoppers, and one passenger car. But another name change came along. In 1909, the Duluth, Winnipeg, and Pacific Railway. By 1913, 2 passenger trains a day were crossing into Canada. But markets change, it's inevitable, and soon finished lumber, grains, potash, and refrigerated cars carrying loads of fish made up the majority of freight. But with the completion of Highway 53 in 1935, passenger traffic diminished greatly. And the last passenger train that went across the bridge here was on the 1st of July, 1961. Today, the bridge remains busy with 200 plus, or 20 plus trains a day, each carrying up to 100 to 200 cars. And the trains are dominated, as I'm sure you've all noticed, by flat cars holding double-stacked containers that were sourced through here from Prince Rupert, British Columbia.
Okay, how many of you here know the name Harry Erickson Jr.? I would hope quite a few people know about Harry Erickson Jr. because I'm not going to talk about him. Today I'm talking about his dear father and his uncle John and Harry Erickson, so Harry Sr. So when you think Rainier, you think rough, rough and tumble, you think these, burly people, and you'd probably be right if you were to look at most of the people living in Rainier at the time. So Harry and John Erickson would fit that very, very well. So the two brothers, Harry is the older, and John being younger. Harry was born in 1878, and John born in 1884. They did not grow up in Rainier. They were both born in other places in Minnesota, but they found themselves coming to Couchiching around the same time. In 1905, Harry Erickson Sr. came to what is now International Falls, and he was working as a carpenter and kind of doing odd jobs. And then the next year in 06, John Erickson went to Fort Francis and was doing similar odd jobs around the area. But as Mike was just talking about, the railroad was starting to be built and came up in 1907, and the Erickson brothers saw that as a good opportunity to go where the new railroad was going to be, which is Rainier. So in 1907, the two brothers, they joined up and they moved to Rainier together. And for a year, they were kind of just getting on their feet. They're doing different things around town. They built their houses and their cabins that they had out here. But then in 1908, they decided that they were going to make a partnership and open a store. So it's not here anymore, but in the parking lot, the Cantilever parking lot, that was the location of the original Erickson's collaboration store. And John and Harry Erickson, they worked together for quite a few years, and they mostly sold furs. They would travel via dog sled way up into Canada to get the furs. So they were doing all this really cool stuff, but they obviously weren't manning the store. So it was really opportunistic that they decided to get married, and they found women who were willing to marry them and live in the area. So Harry Erickson married Grace Erickson in 1913, and there's a fun story she told in an oral history that when she was first visiting the area, when she was still trying to decide if she wanted to marry Harry and live here, she comes up and is visiting, and she's staying at one of the only boarding houses in the town. And at the time, the railroad was doing some blasting, and she was having her breakfast and her morning tea with the proprietress of the boarding house, and a giant boulder fell through the roof and then through the floor, like right in front of them where they were having their breakfast. And after that point, she was just like, I could live here. This place is kind of exciting. There's always something going on. So since 1913, Grace kind of had to take over the store because John and Harry, they really liked their dog sleds, and they really liked going out trapping and buying furs in Canada. And they were gone a lot. So Grace pretty much had the store. It should have just been called Grace Erickson's store. Until 1920, when John Erickson married Gina Finstead, who was related to George Finstead, which we'll talk about later. But that's also the same year that the partnership between the brothers dissolved. We don't know exactly why it dissolved, but Grace hinted at a dispute in another oral history she shared. She said that in 1920, quote, we didn't build the new one, the store, until after John married, and then she, Gina, wouldn't have us around, so we bought those lots and built. Those lots that she's talking about is now Looney's. So in 1920, after the brothers split and they went their own ways in their business world, Harry Erickson built what is now Looney's, and they operated their stores right across the road from each other for a long time until John Erickson finally kind of got out of the business, and because John and Gina had a daughter, Arden Barnes. So Arden kind of took over after a while, and then Harry Erickson, he had his store for about another decade. He sold in the 1930s, and then over time it changed hands several times. There's someone in here sitting in here who owned it. There's a couple people in here, I think, who've owned it before. But it changed hands, and then the Harry Erickson Jr., we know, he eventually got it in the 40s, and he had his fine store there for quite a while. So that's the story of the two Erickson brothers. Before I switch back over to, I think, Mike, I have just like an interesting story about Harry Erickson. He apparently was scary. Scary Harry. He was a very scary man, apparently. So during Prohibition, he was really good at taxidermy, like really, really, really good at taxidermy. And he had a lot of mounts in his store. And the customs officers were really suspicious that his store was popular during Prohibition. And so they were starting to suspect that he was using his mounts to hide booze. And so one officer comes into the store and accuses him of hiding contraband in his taxidermy pieces. And he's walking around, trying to be all tough, and he goes to reach for a mount to take it apart to see what's inside of it. And Harry Erickson supposedly just said one word. He said no, and except he said it way scarier than I just did. And the officer understood. He quickly left the store, never bothered him again, and later that day, a couple blind pigs were busted. So that officer was looking for someone to arrest, and he did not find it with Harry. He did not think it was worth the effort. Harry was a little too scary. It's also said that Harry Erickson was present during the fire that burnt down the old European hotel in Rainier. According to this story, he was playing his accordion there, or he was scheduled to play his accordion there at the hotel, and he was warming up, and some dude comes running in yelling, "Fire, fire, fire." And he thought it was a practical joke, and he told everyone to calm down, everything's always on fire, yada, yada, yada. And so he's warming up, about to do his accordion set, and then the room starts filling with smoke. And so then he said, no, okay, it was real. And so then other people come out from the back of the hotel saying that there's a fire and they need to go get the fire engine. So I don't know if anyone's aware of what the fire engine would have looked like at the time. it was horse-drawn, and it was steam-powered, so it took a really long time to get it up to temp. If anyone wants to see it, it's at the museum. And it was also wintertime, and quote from this story I read, they didn't think there'd be any fires, so they didn't clear out the fire hall. So the fire engine was snowed in, the hotel is on fire, Harry Erickson is trying to help people figure out what's going on. They shovel out the engine, they get the horses hooked up, they get it running around, waiting for it to fill up with steam. Harry Erickson is sitting on top of it with a funnel, and they're like bailing water into the big tank to heat up the water. Gets to the hotel, no water. Someone forgot to put in the drain plug. So as they were waiting for it to warm up, it was just heating up an empty barrel. And so by the time they figured out what was going on with the engine, hotel, gone, ashes. They didn't stand a chance. But Harry Erickson did save his accordion. That is the moral of the story. And then a quick fun fact about John Erickson, he was really good at dog sledding. He would regularly go from the Paw, I think it's how it's pronounced, in Canada, all the way to Fort Churchill and back. He would do that all the time, apparently. He was really good at it. They're pretty cool dudes. Their wives, they held down the fort, so they should get the real credit, but...
I'm going to talk a little bit about the streetcar line. It's one of the subjects that when I do my research for this program, I was very, very unfamiliar with it. I'd heard about the streetcar line, but I knew absolutely nothing about it. But in 1909, as International Falls grew and prospered, muddy roads in the winter months, in the warm months, and then snow-covered roads in the winter were warmer. And more often than not, travel to and from Rainier to International Falls was difficult and time-consuming. But in 1909, a man by the name of A.L. James of the American Suburbs Company of Minneapolis petitioned for a franchise to build a streetcar line between International Falls and Rainier. But from the very beginning, there were delays. In fact, with the public's dissatisfaction with the project, L.H. Nord got permission to build a rival line. To settle the dispute between the two of them, the decision was decided to be put up to the voters. And by a vote of 360 to 55, the majority went for Nord's company, the American Traction Company, and they ended up with the franchise. James, then, of course, was bought out. And it was all the way to July 3rd, 1917, that the line finally was in business. And for 15 cents, a person could take the trip on the 30-passenger coach. The gasoline-powered coach proved unreliable, so a battery-powered system was put in place. But this became problematic when E.W. Backus was reluctant to provide electricity for charging the batteries. The streetcar line lasted just several years, and it was said that the only money that was made by the project was through the sale of lots that were adjacent to the roadway.
So now we're going to talk about Jim Dion. Does anyone know Jim Dion's name? A few people. So he's kind of like the first George Finstead, except he's his own person. So Jim Dion, he was born in 1882 in Wisconsin, and he spent a lot of his younger life traveling, doing different jobs. He spent a lot of time in Seattle, Washington as a shipbuilder, and a little bit in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, running his own boat building business. I don't know if he came to Rainier to run his ferry service, but when he got to Rainier in 1910, he was running a ferry service on the lake. So I don't know if that's why he came, or if it, the chicken or the egg, I don't know which one came first. But anyway, he was in Rainier in 1910, and just like George Finstead, Jim Dion was just like this mega genius. He could think and make and build just about anything. In 1911, he married his then wife, Helen McCool, and built the machine shop. Not the machine shop that we know now. He built his machine shop. And then he had to build it again because it burnt a year later. So in 1911, he built the first rendition, it burned, and then in 1914, the Auto Marine shop that we have now is what he built. And the Auto Marine shop, it's a machinist's dream. He did fantastic. We obviously know what it looks like, and for those who haven't been inside the machine shop, he has several machines. He's got like a lathe, a mill, some other things that I can't remember the name of, all powered by a hit and miss single stroke engine. And so the engine's going. If you've ever seen a demonstration of it in the summertime during Rainier's days, it's awesome. And it spins a belt that powers every single machine in the shop. So you don't have to, sit and start a single machine. They're all going whenever you need it. He was known for being really good with weapons like guns, and he was really good. He was working on a patent for like a barrel for a .22 rifle. So he was smart. He was always doing stuff. People would bring their cars, their boats to him, and his Auto Marine shop was actually just an auto shop to begin with. And that's because he had a friendship with someone we've talked about in previous shows named William Hapgood. So William Hapgood, he was the guy who tried to make a utopia out on Rainy Lake on Deer Island. He also had a canning business and he had some money. And so when Jim Dion was first trying to get his shop up and running, Hapgood had loaned him some money, and his initial interest was getting into the car business, selling cars, because at the time, cars were just finally starting to make their way into Coochin County. But that quickly turned into a marine business, being on the lake, and he had his ferry service, and he had the boat winch that he would store boats in the wintertime. So it very quickly became the Auto Marine shop from just the auto shop. But the interesting thing about the relationship between Dion and Hapgood is that they had a falling out, and it was very public. The Rainy Lake Chronicle that Ted Hall had done, he did like a whole 2-month spread of the fallout that had happened between Dion and Hapgood back in the late teens and early 20s. So when Dion was starting to try and get out of his machine shop business, he was getting a little bit older. He'd already done his service in World War I, looking for different things to do. He got with Hapgood, and Hapgood offered him a job at his canning factory in Indianapolis. And they had corresponded back and forth over the terms because Jim Dion didn't want to be working, 7 days a week all the time like he had been at his shop. And he went and visited. They came to some agreeable agreements, and he moved to Indianapolis to work at his canning factory. But then he very shortly left the canning factory and came back to Rainier. And through these very public letters, they were calling each other all sorts of wild names. I think it was a bit of a misunderstanding, but Jim Dion didn't want to work every day and accused Hapgood of making him work every day, but then Hapgood accused him of never being at work and calling him lazy. So it's, who do you believe? And it was just this back and forth, this very public back and forth. Jim Dion was talking smack about Hapgood in Rainier. Hapgood was talking smack about Dion over in Indianapolis. Hapgood was supposed to have bought the machine shop, but then he said that Dion didn't give him the papers to buy it. But then Dion said that you never asked for the papers and you weren't giving me a good price. It was this big back and forth. All of that to say, he came back and sold his shop to George Finstead. So not much is known about Jim Dion's early life, like I said, but his time here in Rainier was just inventing things. He had several patents, storing boats. Anytime anyone had any kind of problem or needed a gun built, it was there at the shop. So he was the foundation that was to then become George Finstead.
So I'm going to share a little bit about a gentleman that many of you probably knew, or at least the name will be familiar, and that is Dan McCarthy. I was hoping to be able to connect with his daughter, Mary Jane, but I was unable to. We did not hook up. So I don't have as much information as I would like to, but I still have enough to share that you will find interesting about him. So Dan was born Daniel Joseph McCarthy on January 23rd, 1895 in Butte, Montana. And his parents were Michael and Nora McCarthy, and they were Irish immigrants. They came to the United States in 1885. And I don't know what it is about that area of Montana, but there's like a huge concentration of Irish people there at that time, and there were a lot of McCarthys, which I thought was interesting. Dan had several siblings. He was the oldest, but there was Julia, John, Mary, Elizabeth, and Margaret. So I don't know a whole lot about his early life. I know he graduated high school, thank God. And at some point, he gets to Couchiching, and the first record of him being in Rainier is 1917, where he has a partnership with H.W. Keys in the Lakeside Fish Company. But in June of that year, he registers for World War I, and then in April of 1918, he is shipped out. He serves in the Army. I don't know where he goes. I tried to find that out, but I was unsuccessful, sorry. And he was discharged a year later in April of 1919. So he comes back to Rainier. He's in the Lakeside Fish Company, and then he later acquires that in the mid-1920s and operates it until roughly 1965. In February of 1931, he gets married. He's married to Beulah Amanda Schmidt. So you've probably seen pictures before with like Winston Schmidt and that whole family. That is her brother. He was a commercial fisherman. And so then they would go on to have some children, Dan Jr., Mary Jean, John, Jim. And Dan owned numerous properties across Rainier. He had properties in International Falls. Some of them, just to name a couple, would be like the old bank building, of course. He also owned the Tin Shack. That would be later acquired by Ted Hall, the old Sharon Ball residence. That's gone now, obviously. The Tin Shack he used as ice storage, and then the bank building was his main headquarters for his fish company and his beverage distribution business that he also ran. One thing that was interesting about Dan is that he served as Couchiching County Commissioner for several years, and it was during the time when Couchiching was facing gross financial instability. Shocking. And it was during this time that the county was paying their employees with script. So basically, they're just giving them monopoly money and telling them that they can use this in stores. And the stores, not trusting that the county was actually going to pay them, they were discounting this script by 50% or more. So these people really aren't getting anything for the script that they're being paid in. So Dan is obviously really good about this. So he starts fighting in the legislature. He goes down and he has multiple meetings to try to fight for legislation that is going to be more favorable for the citizens of Couchiching County and secure a better financial future for the citizens here, because these people obviously deserve to be paid. Dan also owned several boats, two of which that I'm sure most people are familiar with are the Danny and the Mary Jean. The Mary Jean was purchased to be a family cruiser, but he took a lot of friends and guests out on it. The family never really went out on their own with it. It was always full of people, and that was really Dan's intention, because he wanted to be able to bring people out on Rainy Lake and have them have a good time. And then the Danny, of course, was used more for commercial purposes. The Danny was built sometime in 1943, and it had been captained by numerous individuals, including Herb Williams, Frank Bowman, and then probably more recognizable was Lauren Erickson. The Danny's last summer on the lake happened to be in 1968, and it ended up hitting a rock, and the back of the boat got broken, and so it was hauled up onto shore, and then someone vandalized it and then lit it on fire. So it does not exist. There were a lot of fond recollections going through looking for information about Dan. One of them that I thought was kind of cute was during the 1920s, there were a lot of kids that would go over to watch hockey games, and it only cost 10 cents, well, only, cost 10 cents to get to the rink. And so there were all these children that were standing around wanting to go in and watch hockey, but they have no money, they're broke. And so Dan would show up with his friend Stan to also go watch these games and see all these kids standing around. So they would go inside and they would settle up with the rink guy, and he would pay for a bunch of these kids to get into the rink all the time. So that was pretty nice of him to do. And then Dan ended up passing away in International Falls. He died at Falls Memorial Hospital on July 11th, 1990, and he is buried at the Forest Hill Cemetery in the American Legion plot.
Now, often in my discussions about some very interesting history, I talk about the three companions: alcohol, mostly illegal abuse, prostitution, and gambling. In Rainier's early days, all three were significant, especially so after the arrival of the railroads. But at that time, this area was booming. There were thousands of men who were employed building E.W. Backus's empire of paper mills, dams, sawmills, his board mill, and even his city. Thousands more were employed in the woods, cutting and hauling timber to satisfy the insatiable appetite for timber. And all these men had money in their pockets. They had money to spend. And the three companions, of course, were available to take advantage of it. The most notable locations were right in the very southern part of Koochiching County, 2nd Street, International Falls, and the little city of Rainier. Things got so bad that Koochiching County went dry in 1916, but the laws were never seriously enforced. For failure to enforce the laws, the governor of Minnesota removed Mayor Pete Gibbons of Rainier from office in 1917, along with the mayor of International Falls and the sheriff of Koochiching County, all for failure to uphold the laws. And about that period of time, a new person showed up on the scene, Robert Sloan Williams, my grandfather. He immediately went into business, and by 1918 owned the Brennan's Saloon here in Rainier and the Kettle Falls Hotel up the lake. And he profited from the three companions and expanded his businesses. His fronts were always soft drink parlors with liquor in the back room and gambling and female companionship always available. But he not only manufactured his own whiskey through numerous stills, but he also smuggled liquor in from Canada. He was referred to as the ringleader in this area, but was never caught. Although it is said that he took over the welfare of families of the men that were workers when they were arrested. But times change. Prohibition ended in 1933. The Great Depression was in full force, and the vast forests of pine were depleted. No longer were there thousands of men looking for a good time. But roads were improved and tourists were arriving. Summer resorts were being built. Customer base, my grandpa, had changed, and the demands for the three companions went along with it. But my grandfather adapted well with the change and opened what was called the Williams Nightclub. And that was located right over here across the tracks where the post office is now. It featured liquor, food, and quality floor shows for entertainment. It became a very popular spot for International Falls nightlife. Unfortunately, it burned in 1942 and was never rebuilt.
So now that we've talked about Jim Dion, we can talk about George Finstead. You can't talk about one without the other. So George Finstead, he was born May 1st in 1898 in Superior, Wisconsin. His family stayed in Superior for a little while. His dad worked at some factories down there, but they took out a homestead claim in Pike, Minnesota, or near Pike. It was in the general Crane Lake area. And because money was tight, his father had to stay in Superior and sent George's mother and George and all of his siblings to Crane Lake to settle up their claim. So it was pretty much up to, again, the wife to do everything. And she enlisted the help of her children, and they were able to settle up their claim, and they had their homestead. So George's early life was filled with a lot of hunting, trapping, just general manual labor and survival. But eventually he grew up, and at the time, World War I was happening when he was in high school. And I could not figure out what year he graduated high school in. That's because he didn't. Because right before his high school graduation, he enlisted and he joined the American Expeditionary Force and was sent off to Europe. And so he did serve in World War I in Europe, and because of that, he never finished high school, which is fine. High school's not for everyone. So. It's not at the time. So he did his time in World War I, and then fast forward some years, he also did help out in World War II. He worked on what is sometimes known as the Alaskan Highway. It connects Alaska to the lower 48. So he did work on that during World War II. But go back a little bit to his younger years. Before he came to Rainier in 1922, he was the postmaster in Ord, and he also worked for the Virginia and Rainy Lake Logging Company as a paymaster. He kind of did their billing. But then he found himself in Rainier in 1922, and he ran into Jim Dion. And he saw Jim Dion, and he saw his wonderful shop, and he liked what was going on there, and he was like, yep, this is it. This is where I want to be, this is what I want to do. So he started working for Jim Dion, which, as we recall from just a few minutes ago, he just recently had his falling out with Hapgood, and so his shop didn't sell to Hapgood, which was lucky because if that had happened, George Finstead probably never would have happened. So it just worked out perfectly that a couple of years later, George Finstead and his brother Morris were able to buy the machine shop from Jim Dion in 1924. So from 1924, George took his place, and Jim Dion said, see ya, I don't ever want to work again. So it worked out perfectly for both parties involved. And as most of us probably know, George Finstead, from that day on, he was a staple of Rainier. He was at his auto marine shop all the time. He was putting in, taking out boats. It was his job to take care of all of the boats on the lake, essentially. All the people who had boats at the time, they didn't live here. Surprise, surprise, they were not locals with the big giant boats. And they needed a place to store their boats in the winter, and it fell on George, and he happily took on the job. Him and his wife, because he got married to that's his sister. He did not marry his sister. We're clear that he did not marry his sister. He married Clara in 26, so she helped out at the shop too when he was busy. But he, at the height of the marine shop, he was taking care of 30 of the biggest boats, American boats on Rainy Lake, and they were all wood boats, so they needed a lot of care and time. The biggest of them was a 48-foot Chris Craft. For all of you boat people, I don't know what type of Chris Craft exactly. All I know is that it was huge. It was 48 feet, and it was called the Lita 2. That's all I know, and it was owned by the president of the Red Owl grocery stores.
It was amazing.
Yeah, big boat, big beautiful boat. And there was 29 other ones that he took care of. And like I said, those boats did not belong to locals, unfortunately. And when he wasn't selling or working on boats, he was selling Johnson Motors. So if anyone's ever seen the marine shop, it's covered in like Johnson Motor, not propaganda, but like paraphernalia. And so he actually was one of the first franchisees of Johnson Motors. So they did their franchises like in groupings, and he was part of their first like test group of franchising Johnson Motors. And it turned out he was really good at selling Johnson Motors, and he knew them inside and out. He was their top selling representative. It was also said that he was so good with Johnson Motors that Johnson Motors would make their motor, whatever new one they're coming out with. Then they would bring George up to their factory, their headquarters, and have him teach all of their technicians how to run it and how to fix them. So everyone pretty much learned from George Finstead. He was a genius. He also, in 1932, he sent a letter to Johnson Motors And he said, here, look what I'm doing. And they featured it in their magazine. Here's what he had been doing. He had been using a 16 horsepower Johnson motor to create a skating rink out here on the lake. So like skating on the lake is hard because it's bumpy, the conditions aren't always perfect for skating, and people wanted to skate, so George took it upon himself to find a solution to that. And he mailed them a picture of him flooding the frozen lake. He had created with a little rink. And I'll read you what he wrote on the back of this postcard of this picture of himself that he sent to Johnson Motors. Quote, covers space 300 feet by 500 feet with 3 inches of water in about an hour. Trough is 10 inches by 12 inches by 10 feet with 16 horsepower Johnson mounted on a bracket with the wheel just inside the trough. Tried several other methods of flooding, but this beats them all. So he was all about it. He did everything. He was also just an all-around nice guy. A bunch of people said that as kids, they'd all get their bikes fixed by George Finstead. When your chain broke or your handlebars were crooked, you take it to George Finstead and he'd fix it right up and send you on your way. He also, to supplement his income starting in World War II, because business was slow, he would be hired by the paper mill to go fix their machines and make new parts for the machines because he had the machine shop. And he only charged them $3 an hour for his labor to fix the machines. And that was starting in World War II. He kept that same hourly rate until his death in '75. So they continued to use his help at the mill, but he would not charge any higher than that. So $3 an hour was his rate to help people out because it was easier to have him do it because then you can keep the machines running and there's no downtime and people aren't out of work for when the machines are down at the time. So he was just like a nice man. And he was smart. He had several patents, but unfortunately he was so humble, only one of them were actually in his name. So companies would seek him out. They would come to him with a problem. We need a part that can fix whatever. And he would think of it, design it, make it, and they'd have a patent taken out, but it would be in the company's name. He never wanted the honor of it. But one day he came up with a way to make outboard motors go into reverse without having to do all of the workaround. And he patented that. And that's the only patent that's in his name. So he was really proud of that one. So, but he's got a ton of patents. They just aren't legally his. And then unfortunately he died unexpectedly in 1975 at his home here in Rainier. And his wife Clara did continue to work the shop and keep it running for a few years after that. But now it's on the Register of Historical Places since '83. So in the summertime, they come and open it. And if you ever have the chance, if you haven't already, it's worth going to look at. And you can still hear the machine that he had going just about every day of his life.
All right, so I'm going to wrap up with the last person before Mike regales you with stories and lies. So this is definitely somebody that everyone has either known, heard of, or has read his work, and that is the infamous Ted Hall, the thorn in every politician's side in the 1970s for the community of Rainier. And so he was born Edward Matson Hall on October 14th, 1920 in Red Wing, Minnesota, and then he grew up in Frontenac, Minnesota. His parents were Edward Ned Samuel Hall and Lenore Hall, and he had 3 siblings, Pauline, Ruthie, and Sila. And his father, Ned, was a newspaperman who kind of turned into a calendar manufacturer like a little bit later. So Ted was already very familiar with news reporting and the printing process from a very early age. When he was 7 years old, he created his own tiny little magazine called Old Man River, and he was very proud of that. His early education occurred in a kind of old room, one-room like country schoolhouse, and then once he got to high school age, he attended Red Wing High School. From there, he went to Hiram and Antioch colleges, and then he departed Antioch College, but he did not get a college degree. like he didn't finish. His newspaper career really began when he was in high school. He was reporting for the Red Wing Daily Republican, and he would do that like on his summer vacations between high school or college, and then he did work there when he had a year in between his sophomore and junior year of college. And then once he had left Antioch, he serves 4 years in World War II. He was in the Merchant Marines, and after leaving the service as a second mate during the war, he freelanced for a year in England. And during that time, he was seeing a woman named Muriel Wells, and when he was in England, he ends up getting married to her in July of 1946. So they're in England, Muriel gets pregnant with their first child, Rebecca, so they decide that they're going to come back to the United States in the spring of 1947, and they got settled in northern New Jersey. Ted immediately got a reporting job at the Newark Evening News, and then in 1950, he was promoted to city staff, and after doing that for several years, he got promoted to being an editorial writer. Now, Ted's writing for the editorials was primarily political, but every now and then he would kind of have these like cheeky one-off or like fun, uplifting editorials. One of his most well-known ones was an editorial he wrote when Billie Holiday died. He also wrote, he did a lot of reporting on the Brown versus Board of Education, and he had written an article in 1954 that was submitted for a Pulitzer Prize. I don't believe he won it though, but it at least went before the committee. In September of 1956, Ted and Muriel's second child, Thomas, was born. And then throughout the 1960s, he worked for various newspapers, 2 of which were the Morning Call, which was in Paterson, New Jersey, and then the big one was the Herald News. Now, when he was working for either one of these, he was reporting on a myriad of different activities, but one of the big ones was the Attica prison riots in 1969. And it was really difficult to be reporting on that, but he did a great job. And then he was writing another story. It was a very sensationalized murder trial, and it involved a prominent local judge. And the Herald News was like, you know what? We're gonna kill this story. Like, you can't write it, you're done. And Ted said, no, we need to hold these people accountable, and we're gonna write this story about this judge. And the Herald News was like, you know what? You're fired. So they fired him, and then 2 days later, he gets picked up by Time Magazine, so it really didn't matter. So he got hired by Time Magazine, and he became their political editor. And that was nice because one thing that Ted firmly believed in was he was a huge advocate for good government, and he firmly believed that journalism held a role in maintaining that and being able to call people out and, you know, just kind of poke the bear whenever it needed to be done. And that became very obvious when he came to Rainier and was writing the Chronicle. So by the 1970s, he's tired of the East Coast journalism rat race. He decides he's done with it. He goes off and buys a lobster boat, the Claire, and he sails with Thomas from there to Duluth. And then he trucks the boat from Duluth to Rainier. So how does he end up in Rainier even? It's because he met Ernest Oberholzer when he was a child, living in Frontenac, growing up there, and he started summering here around the age of 9. And he had been hired by Ober when he got to be kind of more of a young man to work on the island in the summers for some pocket money in between him working for the journal. So that's kind of how he ends up here. And he was really good friends with Ober. When Ober died, he did a lot of writing for that, and he was one of the people who was instrumental in bringing Ober's Islands under the Oberholzer Foundation and establishing them. And he's an emeritus board member of that organization. So it was his life in Rainier that really inspired him to start the Rainy Lake Chronicle, and it was written in his obituary that even amongst his professional colleagues, that the Rainy Lake Chronicle was probably Ted's, not only his greatest achievement, but probably his most famous achievement that he was known for. So the Ringling Chronicle, he was editor, etc. from 1974 to 1980 when he sold the Chronicle and he started writing books. One of them we have available for sale. It's his Growing with the Grass, which is his little memoir of his childhood and growing up in Frontenac. The Chronicle was published until May of 1982, and then it completely ended. But it was known for covering local politics in a very energetic and detailed style, you know. But again, he was not scared to ruffle people's feathers, and the way that he was writing got people engaged in the community. It got locals more interested in the political atmosphere of what was happening, and it was keeping them educated on what was going on. The Chronicle had a really large circulation, 1,700 people, with a total readership estimated at over 10,000. And his salary for all that work was $5,000 a year. Ted ended up passing away on September 23rd, 2003, at the age of 82 at the Little Fork Nursing Home.
Well, I'm going to finish with the stories, and I've really told you I wouldn't call them lies. I would call them stories that you're not going to find in any history books. But the first one is the $10,000 dog. You wonder how it happened back in the early 1920s when the dog was worth $10,000. But my grandfather had a load of liquor being smuggled by rail from Canada, and he arranged for the purchase of a dog for my father. And he had my father's dog in the boxcar, and it was barking, and it drew the attention of the officials over here at the station. They broke the seal on the car and discovered the liquor. And my father ended up with the dog, but I guess it was a $10,000 loss for my grandfather. But there's also the story of the drunken pigs. My grandfather had a large still right down here on the property that Annie Hersey lives on now. It was a very large still, had tunnels going all through, but as a byproduct of the manufacture of alcohol, of course, you have mash. And the neighbor's pigs broke the fence down, got in the mash. And I heard stories that there was up to 100 of them. But they went on a drunken rampage all through the neighborhood, including here in the right here. Well, there's another story, kind of a morbid one, but the story of a man that, you know, it was rough times back then. We got murdered here in Rainier, it was the winter. And perpetrators, to dispose of the body, stuffed it in the community water hole and the ice down here at the lower dock. First, you got a hole that's kept open all the time by people drawing water out of it, because you got snow, of course, on top of the ice. And the body was not discovered until spring when the heat of the sun melted the snow off and the body was seen underneath. My father used to say that all winter long, people drew the water in Rainier from between this poor guy's legs. And then there's the shooting of Jim Lassard. Jim was part of the well-known Lassard family here in Rainier. But he was in one of the soft drink parlors with several of his friends, two guys and a gal. And a man came in with a .45 caliber revolver, and Jim asked him what he was up to, and he said something like, "Well, you'll find out, and here's a piece of it." And he shot poor Jim right square in the chest, shot his friend in the chest, killed him, emptied the till of $26, for a murder, and out the door he went. But Dr. Craig, the well-known doctor in this part of the country, in fact, Dr. Craig, who lived with me, when he operated on Jim, he said that Jim's heart was in the contracting stage, so when the bullet went through and into his chest, it didn't tear into the heart muscle, so he survived. He lived to be elderly. Well, then there's a story that Herb Williams told me. There was a young man with one of his friends, and time of year was winter, probably towards spring, ice was starting to deteriorate, and he and his friend were operating a still somewhere out here on Reedy Lake. But two agents, state or federal, I'm not sure, drove up in a sedan, arrested the two of them, and were taken in, to jail, custody. And her big guy, good guy, that refused to be handcuffed, his buddy, for whatever reason, relented. And as the sedan was coming back across the lake, it broke through the ice, up to the bottom. Herb and the two agents survived, but that poor guy is still out there in that vehicle in the bottom of Rainy Lake somewhere. And I often wonder when they're out here in Sand Bay or something, and fishing, when they come across a bump, I think, he's a wonderful possibly to be that father. Then my dad was involved with a similar incident. As a young man, he was helping my grandpa out, supplying the stills, winter months. And so they had two pickups loaded with sugar. Whether they had corn or other things aboard, I'm not sure. But they went through the last day portage out in the Saginaw Bay. And the lead vehicle, once they got to the big part of the lake, broke through the ice, sunk instantly. My dad and his friends stopped short. And I of course assumed that the poor older guy that was driving the front pickup was history, but he popped to the surface like a corpse and climbed out. But you can imagine the predicament that he was in. Because every time I drive over that spot, it's 66 feet deep. And I think, how long did he stay in that vehicle before he got out of it and then somehow found his way up to the surface? But there's a lot more stories, and you'll have to come to the next program to hear them.
All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out.